Welcome back. So here it is finally. This is two of my favorite things all in the same box. KZ HBB DQ6S. So for those of you who aren't familiar, I actually started out doing KZ reviews. Those were probably my very first 3 or 4, 5 initial reviews were all KZ sets at the time. And also at the time, I was a big fan of HawaiiBadBoy, Bad Guy Good Audio Reviews. So, it is a bit ironic years later to have, both names on the box, but many props to him for, taking the jump from being a reviewer to these collaborations, and props to KZ for giving our community the opportunity to have these opportunities and collaborations come up. So, both of those guys definitely deserve props on this one. So, let's kind of jump into a little close-up of what this one looks like. And for those of you who have the DQ6, this one will look quite familiar. This is the rose gold clear, so you could actually see the XUN hat on top of dynamic driver right there. The other two dynamic drivers are kind of up here and down there. Very hard to see from that angle. You can see they're kind of the two sides of the bodies there. And what's probably not going to show up on camera all that well is the Bad Guy Good Audio Reviews logo right there, and it says KZ HBB DQ6X on the side. So there's a nice logo on the side, just doesn't really show up on camera all that well. So quickly, let's talk about the graph, and we'll talk more about this in detail later. But so DQ6S, a little bit more sub bass here, very similar to DQ6 here, and then a kind of a radical, huge improvement here. And then back to something similar to DQ6 there. So we will get to that when we get to the right sections. So for those of you who actually looked this one up on the KZ store, for some reason the marketing listing says hardcore violent sound quality. And I would encourage them to cross that out and just call this the new flagship. It's really, really good. And I haven't really hid my dislike for ZAS or AST. Whatever they call the flagship from last year, they should pretty much cross that out and just put in DQ6S, because it's actually that good, and it's much better than those two sets. So you want to make a new flagship this year, start with this tuning, make a new $60 flagship, put in some nicer drivers, use the same tuning on a hybrid, dynamic driver, BA, whatever, but this is a very nice baseline that can actually take them forward, as opposed to looking back at ZAS or AST, which weren't as successful. But no, it's not a perfect set, and I'm definitely looking at this 8K peak. So there is something here, there is some energy here. That's not just coupler resonance. There's something that will hit you at certain points on certain tracks. So if I was going to make another flagship, that would probably be the first thing I would address, is reduce that a little bit. But I went back to older star lines. It actually includes the newer star lines. So these are the white clear, but they have the star pattern on top. And so that's like the first revision of the white clear sets. Then there's a newer one that doesn't have the star pattern at all, but the ones included with DQ6X do have the star pattern. They're just the clear white ones. So sound, it's pretty much a refined, relaxed DQ6. There is some dark magic going on in that gain area, and I would call it edge balanced. And by edge balanced, I sort of mean the changes and the boosts were sort of bumped out to the edge here. So a bump out in the sub bass, and then kind of the boost is out here almost in the upper treble area, as opposed to where KZ would normally do it right here in the gain area. So very much a relaxed drop here, and then push it out here and push it out here. So keep this kind of clean and clear, add some body here, give it a relaxed, non-shouty gain area here. So I think it is balanced. It's just balanced not typically the way KZ would do it. So the bass, very much the part that I was really worried about. And if we look about it, like, you sort of in your gut, you think the DQ6 actually had pretty nice bass, and I wasn't too sure that adding some more to it would really help. But it all works. I mean, I just didn't really want to ruin what exists. So definitely the part that I was most worried about and maintaining control and definition and texture and slam while adding more rumble, I think actually all works out the way this was done. So by pushing the energy out here as opposed to down here, so this stays, the mids actually stay quite clean, and you're just getting a lot of the body and a lot of rumble, especially when it's needed. But generally, it's just adding kind of a little bit of weight to it as opposed to adding thickness, which would have happened about right here. So I do think that was the right choice, and probably to his library and ear, that sounds a lot better than what DQ6 did. So like I said, push the energy out, keeps the mids cleaner, keeps all the detail, but it gives you a little body. And Critical said the exact same thing about CRN. It's just a very nice technique to, keep your mids from going too thin without adding a ton of mid bass to give them thickness. So I would call it body and weight as opposed to being really thick is how I would describe DQ6S. So a track like Little Sadie, Crooked Still, very much controlled bass. It's still quick and it's still defined and it never gets lost in the mix. And very much, I think, similar to DQ6, listen to that space between the notes. KZ tends to have this kind of a looser bass. It's kind of a more fun, looser. DQ6 wasn't really the same. And then 6S is even better now because now you have a little more weight to it, but you still have that quick and defined textured bass. So really nice there. So something with a little heavier bass, Madonna's Power of Goodbye. That heavy, persistent texture bass through most of the track sits right below the vocals, and there's a very satisfying weight and body to it. And I will say that, I think this does lean a little heavier than what DQ6 did, and I don't mind it, especially on a track like this, which actually sounds a little better with that much weight to it. But it is a very nice kind of pop style, persistent, weighty, rolling bass. And then when you get to 250, 2 minutes and 50 seconds, that upper range and those strings kick in, and you hear that DD treble, how smooth it is. It's all really, really nice. So yeah, I don't concerned, but I think it all worked out for the best there. So the mids, probably the most anticipated part. And as I sort of alluded to, KZ would normally pop up at about 2K, and you end up with something that's a little bit too shouty, and then DQ6, popped up at 5K, and you end up with guitars or even snares, something that was popping out of the mix at that peak. So by cutting over, your female vocals are now super smooth and transition almost magically into treble, and then you're adding some of your clarity and detail back in at about 4K or 4.5K, but not popping over, which is what some other sets do. So you can almost see, so my target right here, that's about Tenjin's Oxygen. Dark Magician, for those of you who are into that, I think is actually somewhere right around the old DQ6, and I think it cut across through the middle. So now we have DQ6 doing kind of a very similar but lower, but popping up higher here. So you can kind of see how he played with the tuning to smooth out this shoutiness, put the clarity back into the vocals and other instruments, and then this sort of carried over. But yeah, like I said about Dark Magician, it's kind of a brilliant move to really smooth out this transition from mids into treble that way. So it was my most anticipated part just because I knew, looking at the graph, that's what he did. And what that really you end up with, especially with some of the KZ's past sets from last year, a more balanced midsection. You have this DD natural sounding midsection, but better than most recent KZ sets, simply because the lower mids have the weight in the body. They're not crossing over into a too thick area. The male and the female lower vocals have proper low end, not too dry, not being dragged, to some peak in the 4K area, and it doesn't blow out and lose detail. So think about your lower vocal people, Gautier, Sam Smith, Madonna. Upper mids, like I said, it's where that magic happens. Smoothed out, you don't have that 2K shouty peak anymore. Very much a relaxed, seamless transition into the treble. And this one, because you don't have that 2K peak, you don't have a heavy, sharp gain area. This thing volume scales like a beast now, so use that to get your mids into the happy spot. And what I mean by that is, if you listen to it at too low of a volume, you'll hear the mids slightly recessed, but keep popping the volume up because your Fletcher-Munson curve is going to kick in, and you'll hear the mids pop into place, but your bass and your treble aren't increasing at the same rate. And so something kind of new for a KZ set, something that you actually hear on other sets. But that simple, this whole cut over is kind of magic for that. And as far as volume scaling, being able to listen to more detail at a higher volume without it getting fatiguing, a lot of that magic happens exactly right there. So yeah, kind of a brilliant move. So the downside of that is female vocals are more relaxed, and there's kind of a lack of shouty bite to it. And like I kind of alluded to, so oxygen at my target is right about there, and you end up with this area and female vocals that have quite a bite to it. It sounds very emotive, and you almost hear female vocals straining a bit as they get a bit shouty. So you don't have that here. So it's just a very different style. I call it relaxed, and it lacks that shouty bite to it. But when you listen to some of the female vocals, like Hayley Williams Simmer, Dua Lipa's Levitating, they still have that sharp, clear sound to their voices. It's just not shouty. So yeah, I'm kind of a big fan of that move. So, and then sort of at a different area, so Avishai Cohen's Teardrop, his trumpet playing, it's one of those songs that I go to a lot for resolution and dynamics. And it's kind of a test for me to hear how much resolution do you have in the mids. Does that trumpet sound like he is hovering right over the microphone? Does it sound like he's blowing air through it? There's a lot of tiny details in the first few notes, and for me it's just kind of a benchmark for hearing resolution, or when something isn't nearly as, or is a low resolution set, or doesn't have the dynamics, it sort of falls flat. So I think DQ6S sort of hits that really well. It definitely, do listen to those first few notes and how dynamic they are. It's kind of cool. It's something that I listen to on lots of sets, so I'm very used to hearing it. So treble, again, you've got 3 DDs, right? So DD treble, more quality, less metallic. If you're used to older KZ sets and that metallic BA sound, that doesn't exist when you have dynamic drivers doing your treble. But really, for me, it's this coherence of the upper mids through that lower treble into the upper treble, and then through extension. All DDs, it literally all sounds like one dynamic driver, and that's the part that really sticks in my head as the unique part of it. It is detailed and really nice sounding as well, but when you hear how smooth that transition is, that's sort of what got me on Dark Magician. It also gets me here. So similar to DQ6, there's that upper bump for air, so notes don't fall flat. This kind of bit out here, preserved from DQ6. It worked well there, so not too surprising it works well here. But I do appreciate that drop from 4 to 6K. So this little bit right here really hits you in snare drums, guitars, whatever instruments are kind of banging your ear at a peak right there. Dropping that down even below my target works really well for me, and it keeps things from really ringing my ears is how I usually describe it. So it gives you clarity without ringing my ears. So slight something around 8K, like I said, and you'll catch the additional sibilance or a sharp snare. Not all the time. It's not like CRN was out of the box, which had a pretty strong 8K peak. This is kind of more of the occasional, I noticed it. So stage, pretty much yes. Haven't been able to A-B with DQ6, but I think it's pretty much the same. It's spacious in each direction, never feels cramped, and you kind of catch lots of instruments up top, above you. Sometimes they're behind you. Technicals are probably the same. I don't think much has actually changed, considering it's the same drivers. I mean, it didn't really pop out to me, and this is sort of a hot take on it, so I didn't spend days on it, but I think it's generally about going to be about the same there. So that's about it. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.